Welcome to Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. Our team's goal is to present science-based information about gardening and all things nature in New York's Hudson Valley. Hosts Jean and Tim, along with team members
Teresa, Linda, and Annie,
are master gardener volunteers for New York's Columbia and Greene counties. So if you're interested in gardening or nature, or nuggets of information about what's happening outside your door, settle in. Enjoy the conversation. Whatever the season, we have something to say.
Here's part 2 of our retrospective series on pests and pathogens with Dede and Jackie.
Welcome back to our segment on pests and pathogens. I'm Dede Terns-Thorpe, and I'm here today with
Jackie Hayden, Master Gardener Volunteer for Columbia and Greene counties.
And today I'll be talking about Anthracnose, which is a group of fungal diseases that affects trees, roses, and garden crops in the Hudson Valley. The word Anthracnose means cold disease, and this gives you a clue as to what to look for. Brown or black dead areas on leaves, stems, flowers, or fruit are symptoms of the disease. Shade trees such as sycamore, ash, oak, maple, elm, hickory, walnut, and dogwood are especially susceptible. If you think about last fall, which followed a relatively wet spring and summer in the Hudson Valley, many maple trees were affected by anthracnose that muted our typical early autumn color. In addition to trees, anthracnose also targets a number of plants, including shrubs, grasses, roses, and garden crops. It's interesting to note that while the symptoms are similar, the specific fungi that cause the diseases are different from host to host.
How much and how quickly do they damage plants?
Good point. It can spread quickly in humid areas with cool temperatures and cause extensive damage, often in less than a week. On trees, anthracnose affects the buds early in the season before they have grown any leaves. When the buds die, it might look like frost injury, which can make diagnosing it tricky at this stage. The symptoms are easier to identify once the trees have leafed out. Look for small, circular, or irregularly shaped dark or brown dead spots on the leaves, or large dead blotches along the leaf veins or in between the veins.
But how do I know if it's that?
Well, to determine whether it's anthracnose, use a magnifying glass to look at the tips of dead twigs or on the underside of the infected leaves. If you see fungal fruiting structures that look like pimples, especially along the leaf veins, the tree is dealing with the anthracnose.
Does it overwinter?
The disease overwinters in affected branches, twigs, and leaves. In the spring, the wind carries the pathogens to young leaves and twigs where it forms new spores. These spores then move by wind or water, spreading to the neighboring foliage, infecting it and thus continuing the disease cycle. Cool spring weather helps to spread the disease.
Does it kill the trees?
Anthracnose diseases tend to defoliate trees from the ground up, but may leave the foliage at the top of the trees undamaged. When a tree is heavily infected early in the season, the leaves may be distorted, shrivel, and fall off prematurely. Sometimes the foliage regenerates. Mature leaves are generally resistant to infection unless the conditions are favorable. Heavily infected leaves will fall prematurely throughout the growing season, and sometimes trees become completely defoliated. Despite the fact that the symptoms look serious, damage caused by anthracnose is minimal and does not seriously harm established trees, but it may weaken them, making them more susceptible to environmental stress such as drought and extreme temperatures and insect damage. On most shade trees, the progress of the disease slows and becomes negligible during hot, dry weather. But it may weaken them, making them more susceptible to environmental stress, such as drought and extreme temperatures and insect damage. On most shade trees, the progress of the disease slows and becomes negligible during hot weather. On roses, we're dealing with a different fungus from the one that causes tree anthracnose. Here, look for small reddish-purple spots or lesions on the leaf veins. As time passes, the spots will develop thin brown margins. If the lesions have distinct edges, you're dealing with anthracnose. The leaves will eventually turn yellow or gray, and as they wither, you'll see small holes in them before they eventually fall off. Note that rose canes and stems can also be affected. Climbing roses, wild and rambler roses, as well as some hybrids and shrubs have been reported to be more susceptible. Remember that anthracnose thrives in humid conditions.
Can gardeners do anything to slow the spread?
While you can't control the weather, you can ensure good air circulation by leaving ample space between your rose plants, as well as by regular and proper pruning. Both are ways that help the leaves dry quicker from dew and rainfall. And when watering, make sure to water only the roots and avoid getting the leaves wet in order to decrease the chance of the fungal spreading. With garden crops, cucurbits and its nightshade plants can be affected by other variants of the fungus.
Could you describe that word?
Sure, it means of the gourd family, your melons, etc. Tomato anthracnose occurs mainly on overripe fruit. The tomatoes will have small, circular sunken spots, often in concentric rings. As the spot grows larger, they cluster together to form large blotches, which may start to ooze. Cucumbers, watermelons, and sometimes even pumpkins can also get anthracnose. The fungus can affect the leaves, stems, and the fruit. The symptoms vary and often resemble other foliage diseases, which can make it difficult to diagnose.
Does it help to rotate these crops?
Yes, absolutely. In this case, as with most edible plants, it's a good idea to rotate the placement of your edible crops. And as anthracnose spreads well in humid air conditions and moisture, avoid overhead watering and provide good air circulation with proper plant spacing and regular weeding.
Can anything help with this problem?
Unfortunately, you won't be able to completely eliminate anthracnose after it enters your landscape, but following a few simple steps can help you reduce and control its spread. Sanitation is the key. Clean up your garden periodically, especially in the fall, to minimize the number of spores overwintering in the soil. Dispose of any infected leaves and plant parts in the trash, not in your compost pile. You could also help to stop the spread of the disease by staying out of infected areas when the plants are wet. Don't collect or save your own seeds if anthracnose is a common problem in your region or in your garden. And make sure to disinfect garden tools after you use them on infected plants. As soon as you notice an occurrence of anthracnose, you can consider spraying affected plants with sulfur or copper. Make sure to follow the manufacturer's instructions for frequency and dosage, but bear in mind that you may need to repeat this application weekly during the entire growing season. Because anthracnose has so many different forms depending on the underlying fungus and the host plant, taking a sample of an infected plant part to your local extension office may help you get a proper diagnosis. I hope you've learned something new with this edition of Pests and Pathogens. Until next time.
You're listening to Nature Calls, conversations from the Hudson Valley.
Hi, my name is Dede Terns-Thorpe, and I'm a Master Gardener volunteer from Columbia and Greene counties with Cornell Cooperative. I'd like to introduce you today to Pests and Pathogens. This is a recurring segment of our Nature Calls podcast, where we'll cover a variety of pests, diseases, and other nuisances that will affect your plants both in and outdoors. Today, we'll stay inside and focus on our houseplants. Insufficient sunlight is a common problem with indoor plants, but another problem is bug infestations. If your houseplant is not doing well and you can't figure out why, chances are you have an insect problem that can damage and even kill a plant. In a nutshell, the best way to control insects and related pests on houseplants is preventing them. But if you are noticing bugs around your plants, the first step in control is to isolate any plant suspected of being infested and work to identify the pest. Then you can start to address the issue. It's important to keep the plant separate from the houseplants until the pest is completely controlled. This process, unfortunately, may take several weeks or more. Due to limited time today, I'll mostly focus on non-chemical controls. I recommend that before you start looking for a chemical solution to a pest problem, effective alternatives should be considered. Early infestations can often be removed by hand-picking, scraping with a fingernail, or addressed using a cotton swab dipped in rubbing alcohol. Spraying a sturdy plant with water or an insecticidal soap will often remove many pests. If you opt for a chemical control, don't expect the problem to be dissolved with one application. Some of these alternatives require persistence, but they can give good control. One of the most important things when you're using a chemical control is to follow and read the directions well. Some of these alternatives require persistence, but they can give good control. Let's start with some very common household plants. Aphids. Aphids are small, soft-bodied, pear-shaped insects. They are usually green, but they can look pink, brown, black, white, or yellow, with spots that appear on all plant parts of the plant. Some aphids have a woolly or a powdery appearance because of a waxy coat. Adults may or may not have wings. They weaken plants by sucking on the stems and the leaves, typically on the new growth or the undersides of the leaves, but some do feed on roots. As they suck the plant sap, you may notice spot yellowing and misshapen leaves, stunted growth, and some deformed buds. When they feed, aphids excrete a sugary material called honeydew, which makes leaves shiny and sticky. A mold fungi may grow on the honeydew, producing dark splotches on the plant surfaces. Aphids can reproduce so quickly that an infestation will cover the plant in days. But as aphids are soft-bodied, they can be killed quite easily by a strong blast of water, wiping them with a cotton swab dipped in rubbing alcohol, or repeated sprays of an insecticidal soap. Remember, however, that insecticidal soaps are contact insecticides, which means that they're only effective when they make direct contact with insects. Once the soap solution dries, it has no effect against pests. Regardless of which control method you use, aphids are persistent, so you need to be diligent to rid your houseplants of these pests. Mites are also very common on indoor plants. They are actually not insects, but are more closely related to spiders. Since they're the size of a pinhead, plant damage is typically the first sign of their presence. If you see yellow-colored speckling or red-brown spots on the upper surface or leaves or on the leaves, or a faded film across the bottom of the leaves, mites may be the cause. Both the adults and the less mature forms can damage plants by sucking plant sap. A telltale silky web, especially on the inner joints of a plant, is often seen with heavier infestations and is unfortunately the easiest way to identify spider mites. Unlike a spider's web, the spider mite webbing is used to protect the colony and enable access to different parts of the plant. These pests prefer dry conditions, so adding some humidity to the air might help to prevent them. Like with aphids, to control spider mites, spray the plant forcefully with water, including the undersides of the leaves, to dislodge them and break up their webs, or to use insecticidal soap. And again, read and follow directions. Follow the instructions on the label, but note that it may be necessary to spray once a week for several weeks to control mites. It's been found that plants placed outdoors during summer have a reduced problem with spider mites. If you do opt to do this, make sure to place your houseplants initially in mostly shade to minimize the chance of sunburn until they adjust to the higher level of light. Now, scale insects and other pests can be found on the stems and leaves, which they feed upon, sucking plant sap. Adults are small and immobile with no visible legs. Scales vary in appearance depending on their age, sex, and species. Some are small, they're flat, and they appear like fish scales stuck to a plant. Others can look waxy, like colored masses. You can find both armored scales and soft scales. An armored scale has a waxy covering that's not an integral part of its body. The covering can be scraped off with a fingernail to locate the insect living beneath it. In contrast, the waxy covering that a soft scale secretes is an integral part of its body. Adult scales are relatively protected from insecticides by their waxy covering. And then there's mealybugs. Mealybugs are a specific soft scale that are commonly found on houseplants. While small, they are distinctive because the adult females cover themselves and their eggs with a white, waxy material, making them look cottony. Nymphs, which look like a smaller version of the adults, hatch from the eggs. Once they begin to feed by sucking sap, the waxy coating starts to form, which helps repel pesticides and makes them somewhat difficult to control. Look for mealybugs on the lower surface of leaves and where the leaf attaches to the stem. They cause stunted and distorted growth and sometimes plant death. Like with aphids, light infestations can be controlled by removing individual mealybugs by hand or wiping each insect with a cotton swab dipped in rubbing alcohol, or using an insecticidal soap spray. With a heavy infestation, it may be necessary to discard the plant. White flies are not true flies, but they are more closely related to scales, mealybugs, and aphids. They are often confused for mealybugs, but the difference is that they will take flight when disturbed. They are very small and resemble moths with a powdery white appearance, and they do secrete honeydew. The immature stage is scale-like and does not move, but they can be found on almost any kind of indoor plant. The easiest way to get rid of these pests is to give them a hard blast of water every now and then. Other insects, like thrips, leaf miners, springtails, and fungus gnats, are less common, but they can also be found on indoor plants. To prevent infestations by any of these pests, make sure to examine a plant before you buy it, and especially again before you bring it indoors. Use clean pots and potting soil, not soil you pulled from the garden. And it's always a good idea to follow the general gardening guidelines when you're caring for houseplants. Water moderately, but don't let your soil become too dry or too waterlogged. By keeping your plants healthy, they'll be better at withstanding any pest infestations, which gives you more time to identify and control indoor plant pests. Please, again, it's very important to read and follow the directions on any chemicals you might be using. Thanks for listening to this conversation from the Hudson Valley Pests and Pathogens. Until next time, nature calls. Thank you.
You're listening to Nature Calls, conversations from the Hudson Valley.
Welcome to Garden Pests and Pathogens. I'm Dede Terns-Thorpe, and I'm here with
Jackie Hayden.
We're Columbia and Greene County Master Gardener volunteers, and today we'll be talking with you about a very common fungal disease often found in the Hudson Valley.
Would that be powdery mildew?
You've got it. Powdery mildew is a disease caused by many different types of fungi. It first appears as a whitish-gray powdery coating on the surface of plants.
It doesn't normally kill the plant, though, does it?
Infection is rarely lethal, but may result in slower than normal growth and distorted leaves, turning them yellow or brown before they eventually fall off the plant. The fungus spreads by spores that are carried on the wind or through physical contact. Unlike other fungal diseases, powdery mildew can develop in dry weather, although it tends to be more severe in wet weather.
Dede, does this develop quickly?
It does. Powdery mildew can develop quite quickly, taking only 3 to 7 days between infection and the appearance of symptoms. Many overlapping infection cycles can occur within a single growing season.
Doesn't it start early in the growing season?
Yes, it actually is more active on plants from mid-spring to early fall. It thrives in areas with warm days and cool nights or in very humid climates. The shady, damp areas in the garden are particularly susceptible. Look for the disease in places where sunshine is blocked by trees, buildings, or fences, and where the soil drains poorly. Once the disease is a problem, avoid late summer applications of fertilizer.
What about the trees? Does it bother them?
With a few exceptions, like apple trees, most trees are not affected by powdery mildew. Powdery mildew on most deciduous trees does little damage and does not require chemical treatments.
Then what does it really attack?
Rather, flowers and shrubs are more likely to be attacked by the fungus. Azaleas, phlox, roses, zinnias, peonies, lilacs, begonias, blueberries, cantaloupe, peas, grapes, and raspberries are all examples of plants that can be infected.
How do you control powdery mildew?
Control begins with the selection of plants resistant to powdery mildew. To also help prevent powdery mildew, however, locate sensitive plants such as lilacs or roses in sunny, dry sites. Allow proper plant spacing, as good air circulation also helps. Consider pruning any affected shrubs that were affected by mildew to allow air to reach as much of the plant as possible. But make sure to clean and disinfect your tools once you have finished pruning.
How do you minimize the chance of a repeat attack?
Well, if you rake up and remove the plant debris that can harbor fungal spores, it'll help a lot.
Do you put that in a compost pile?
Make sure you dispose of the debris in the trash, not in your compost pile. This is essential because the spores can survive over winter. Consider removing plants that repeatedly experience serious mildew attacks and replace them with more resistant varieties.
What if these methods don't work for you?
Well, you could spray with horticultural oil or a registered fungicide that is used to combat powdery mildew, but always read and follow the directions on the label for usage and application information.
Do you only have to do this just once?
Note that some may have to be reapplied every 7 to 10 days. By taking a few simple precautions, you can successfully protect your plants from powdery mildew damage. Thank you for listening to Garden Pests and Pathogens.
This is Jackie Hayden and Dede Terns-Thorpe, and we're looking forward to seeing you in the gardens.
Stay tuned for part 3 of our series on pests and pathogens with Dede and Jackie.
That concludes another episode of Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. We would like to thank Sandra Powers and Devin Connolly from Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene counties for production support. And a special thank you to our listeners for joining us on this episode of Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. You can find links to any of the topics mentioned in this episode at our website at ccecolumbiagreene.org. Comments and suggestions for future topics may be directed to us at columbiagreenemgb@cornell.edu or on the CCE Master Gardener Volunteers of Columbia and Greene Counties Facebook page. For more information about Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene Counties, visit our website at ccecolumbiagreene.org or visit us in Hudson or in Acre. Cornell Cooperative Extension provides equal programming and employment opportunities.